In 1951, the American economist Kenneth Arrow published a result from his PhD thesis about voting systems. A year later, his work was described this way by an MIT economist. The search of the great minds of recorded history for the perfect democracy, it turns out, is the search for a chimera, a logical self-contradiction. New scholars all over the world in mathematics, politics, philosophy, and economics are trying to salvage what can be salvaged from Arrow's devastating discovery that is to mathematical politics what Kurt Gödel's impossibility of proving consistency theorem is to mathematical logic. Politics is full of paradoxes. Many of them are really just issues that we disagree strongly about, but a few have a mathematical basis. We'll cover those in this lecture and the next. As with the paradoxes in this course, Arrow's theorem shows us something really unexpected, something contradictory about the world. We'll get to this gem of a theorem later, but basically, Arrow proved that if you're looking for a voting system that satisfies 4 perfectly sensible-sounding criteria, you're out of luck. There's no such voting system, and hence the comparison to Gödel. No fair voting system exists. Of course, we have to debate exactly what fair means. We'll look at that later, but for now, let's turn to US presidential elections. I'm a little bit of a political junkie, so I like these sorts of questions. What do Samuel Tilden, Grover Cleveland, and Al Gore have in common? The three of them know, or knew, better than anyone else the quirkiness of the US presidential election system. All three would have won their respective presidential elections had the Constitution relied on the popular vote instead of on the Electoral College. 2 of these races were close. Gore won by 0.5 percentage point, but lost in the Electoral College. Cleveland beat Harrison in 1888 by 0.8%, but lost in the Electoral College. He came back 4 years later to beat him in both. And the 1876 race between Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, that wasn't even close. Tilden won the popular vote by 3 percentage points. I don't want to review US civics here, but the presidency isn't decided by majority vote, more than half of the votes, or even by plurality vote, the candidate with the most votes. Instead, each state elects electors, mostly in a plurality manner within the state, and the winner takes all in that state, and then those electors vote in the Electoral College. The impact of this particular election model on modern American politics is incredibly hard to overstate. There are hundreds of millions, there are billions of dollars poured into a handful of swing states, hoping to get to this magical number of 270 electoral votes that are needed to win. Candidates rarely visit the most populous cities, New York, LA, Chicago, Houston. None of those are in swing states. They only go to those cities to raise money. Now, Tilden, Cleveland, Gore, the Electoral College can produce counterintuitive votes, and they knew this. So let's look at a mathematical take on these elections. How counterintuitive can a result be? What do election paradoxes look like? And finally, why is the search for the best election system doomed to fail? That's Arrow's theorem. Before we look at other systems, let's stick with the US presidential system for a second. How counterintuitive could results in such an election be? I mean, we know you can lose the popular vote but win the presidency. How badly could you lose that popular vote? Gettysburg mathematician Chuck Wessel calculated that in some elections, it would have been possible to win the presidency with an astonishingly low 17.5% of the votes, even just in a 2-person race. How could that be? See, a candidate could get just enough to win just enough of the least populous states. The least populous states, they have more weight. The smallest states get a minimum of 3 electoral votes. Even if a candidate didn't get a single vote in the most populous states, they could get to 270 electoral votes with less than 1/5 of the people voting for them. Different political scientists and mathematicians, they've devised different voting methods. Few of them are as convoluted as the US presidential system. Before we get to Arrow's theorem, proving that every one of these has its flaws, let's take a quick survey of these different kinds of voting systems. If you have just 2 options, majority rules is the only fair system. This is actually a mathematical theorem called May's theorem. Things get much more interesting if you have 3 or more options. You might remember Ralph Nader in 2000, Perot in the 90s. If If you go back further, George Wallace even won 45 electoral college votes back in '68. When you have more than two options, voting methods start to get increasingly complicated. And some indication of why they get so complicated is the strategic voting that we've seen in some presidential elections. In 2000, websites popped up where people could trade their votes. A Nader supporter in Florida might vote for Gore if their preferences were Nader, Gore, and Bush, and they would trade votes with a Gore supporter in Texas who would vote for Nader. Their preferences might be Gore, Nader, and Bush. You see, both voters got something. They have avoided their least favorite option while still getting a vote counted for their favorite. It just wasn't their vote. This sort of strategic voting, an ideal voting system would really try to avoid it. There's another reason that three options and more get really confusing, and that has to do with the fact that choices can be cyclic. Let's look at an example of that. For simplicity, suppose you have three voters and three options. Instead of politics, let's think of three friends choosing a restaurant to go to from three choices. Let's call the friends Rebecca, Steve, and Tim. And the restaurants they're going to choose from Brazilian, Chinese, and Danish. So let's suppose their preference is like this. Rebecca prefers Brazilian to Chinese to Danish in decreasing order of preference. Steve prefers Chinese to Danish to Brazilian, and Tim prefers Danish to Brazilian to Chinese. So maybe they should go get Brazilian. No, you see, Steve and Tim both prefer Danish to Brazilian, so they shouldn't do that. How about Danish? No, Rebecca and Steve both prefer Chinese to Danish, so maybe they should go for Chinese. No, Rebecca and Tim both prefer Brazilian to Chinese, and that completes the cycle. Brazilian beats Chinese, Chinese beats Danish, that beats Brazilian, and you go on and on and on. It's actually like a voting version of a rock, paper, scissors game. And that's the Condorcet paradox. This is named after 18th century French mathematician Marquis de Condorcet. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes you have these cycles. If one candidate actually beats all of the others in pairwise matchups, that's called a Condorcet winner. The Condorcet voting method is that if there is a Condorcet winner who wins all of the pairwise matchups, then that should be the winner in your voting system. In this case, when we have these cycles, there's really no resolution. Every option is actually in exactly the same situation. Every option is first on one person's list, second on one person's, and third on one person's. You just have to reject this naive thinking that there should be some sort of order here, and you accept that preferences can form these cycles. One way to think of it is that it's a three-option version of a perfect 50-50 split and requires some random way of determining the winner, like rolling a die or something. There's just no resolution to Condorcet's paradox. It's just one of the strange things about having more than two choices. Cycles are possible. You just have to accept it. The world is a little bit more complex than you might naively think. This Condorcet paradox, it's our first indication that voting systems might be an interesting, complicated topic. One way to settle things if you have three or more candidates is to hold runoff elections. After an initial vote, where each voter gets to vote for their top choice, then the last candidate, or maybe all but the top two, are dropped, and the remaining candidates, they compete in a runoff. Of course, this requires an additional voting day, unless you do something called an instant runoff. And if you want to do that, you have to ask voters to rank all of the candidates. Initially, only their top choices are counted. And if there's no majority, then they drop some candidates off the bottom and they just retabulate. The voters' ballots count for the top choice that hasn't been dropped. California moved to such a method in 2010. And instant runoffs have gained popularity. They're used widely in Australia. Of course, Australia also, interestingly, has mandatory voting. But in the US, San Francisco, Portland, Maine, Minneapolis, they all use some variant of an instant runoff. Interestingly, in Oscar voting for the Best Picture, the system they use is an instant runoff system. Here's another way to decide these sorts of things. You could go with approval voting. In approval voting, each voter votes for as many options as she wishes, for all the ones she approves of. For instance, in the previous example, it's possible that all three people approve of their top two choices. And if you did that, then it would still be a tie vote. Each restaurant would get 2 votes. But maybe Rebecca and Steve are really picky. They really want to go to their top choice restaurant, and the other 2 are not acceptable. And then if Tim approves of both Danish and Brazilian, the voting ends up like this. Brazilian gets 2 votes, Rebecca and Tim. Chinese gets 1, just Steve. And Danish just gets 1, with Tim. With approval voting, they're eating Brazilian tonight. Here's an alternative way to think of approval voting. You could think that each voter gives 1 point to any or all of the acceptable options, and then the option with the most points wins. There's a variant of approval voting, which voting theorists call Borda count. And here, instead of treating all of the approved options equally, voters rank all of the possible options, and the last one on their list gets 0 points. The next to last gets 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, all the way up their list. And then you add up everyone's totals, and the most point wins. For instance, if my preferences were A is my favorite, and then B, and then C, A would get 2 points, B would get 1 point, and C would get 0 points. You add those to everyone else's preferences, and you get a winner. At St. Mary's, where I teach, we actually used this method when we were choosing a new core curriculum a few years back. Finally, here's a voting system that sounds strange, but it's used surprisingly widely. It's called agenda voting. You establish an agenda, you order the options. Let's say if you had options A through D, your agenda might read D, then B, then C, then A. And then you do pairwise voting, like in a tournament, except that you have buys in this tournament. So first, it's D versus B. The winner of that matchup takes on C. The winner of that matchup takes on A. You noticed here that A only had to win 1 race to win the election, whereas D and B had to beat everyone else if they wanted to win that election. In such a system, whoever controls the agenda has immense power. It seems strange, but it turns out that most legislatures work like this. You see, Robert's Rules of Order and all of its variants, if you have 4 different variations of one bill, what happens is you make a main motion, and then you introduce the others as amendments. Which one is the main motion? What order do the amendments come in? That's the agenda. And you vote on each one of the amendments in turn. If it wins, then it's adopted, and it goes up against the next version, the next amendment. Agenda voting, this is exactly what it is. It's sequential pairwise voting. The agenda method, it's open to strategic voting. And there are some interesting cases of this. One of the most interesting has to do with Adam Clayton Powell, who was the first black congressman from New York. On any proposed bill that would lay out federal spending, Powell used to propose that that money would only go to desegregated states in the North. In 1956, there was a school funding bill. It was supported by Democrats both in the North and the South, but it was opposed by the Republicans, the minority. You know, it should pass. It has majority support, right? The problem here was the voting system. Agenda voting allows for strategic voting. And when Powell proposed his amendment that the money only go to the northern states, the desegregated ones, the Republicans in the South voted strategically. They voted for Powell's amendment, even though they really opposed it. The amendment, the Republicans joined the Northern Democrats, and they passed the amendment. And now you had an amended bill. Now the Republicans switched back and voted against it. And the amended bill only got their votes from the Northern Democrats. There was no federal funding for schools that year because of the voting system. All right, so that's quite a list of voting methods we have. Majority, plurality, this Condorcet winner, a runoff, approval, Borda count, agenda. You might think they're all about the same, but they're not. You see, often the voting system affects the outcome, and some of these are subject to strategic voting, like we just saw. The main point of all of this is that an election winner often owes thanks to the voters, of course, but also to the system. A different system might have chosen a different winner. In 1998, former professional wrestler Jesse "The Body" Ventura, he became governor of Minnesota in a 3-way race. There are many different theories about how a Reform Party candidate like Ventura managed to upset both a well-known Democrat, it was Hubert Humphrey III, and a well-known Republican, that was St. Paul Mayor Norm Coleman. This is what the New York Times said about his election the next morning. While Mr. Coleman and Mr. Humphrey were both competent and well-regarded, they lacked luster and began to snipe at each other. For Minnesota, was a negative campaign. Mr. Ventura, on the other hand, is a colorful mixture of affable, often amusing bravado and plain-spoken drive. In one of his television campaign commercials, children play with a Jesse Ventura action figure who scuffles with evil special interest man. These may have been really important reasons, but a key reason why Ventura pulled off this upset is the voting system that was in place. If we look at polling data, we can roughly reconstruct the preferences of Minnesota voters that day. Here's what it looked like. 35% of the population had Coleman as their top candidate, Humphrey as their second favorite. 28% had Humphrey first, Coleman second, and Ventura was third. 20% had Ventura, then Coleman, and then Humphrey. And 17% had Ventura on top, and then Humphrey, and then Coleman. So instead of percentages, let's just think of having 100 voters and see who would win in some of the voting systems we've discussed. If each voter votes once and we have a majority rules system in place, then Ventura has the most votes with 37. That beats Coleman's 35, but he doesn't make it over 50. And so in a majority system, there's no winner. Because he has the most votes, Ventura wins the plurality vote if that were the system. And that's indeed what happened. What if it were a runoff system? Then you would drop the third place, which was Humphrey at 28, and then it's just Coleman versus Ventura. Coleman gets 35 votes and 28 votes and loses the rest, and Coleman wins 63-37. Let's determine if we have a Condorcet winner. We have to look at all of the pairwise matchups. Humphrey versus Ventura. Humphrey wins 35 and 28. Humphrey wins 63-37. Humphrey versus Coleman. Coleman wins 35 and 20. Coleman wins that race, 55-45. Putting these together, we have Coleman winning against either Humphrey or Ventura, and Humphrey winning against Ventura. Notice, Jesse Ventura can't win against just one opponent here. Since Coleman wins all of his pairwise matchups, Coleman is the Condorcet winner. There's no Condorcet paradox. There's no cycles in this particular race. When there is a Condorcet winner, then agenda voting always chooses that winner. If you think about it, the Condorcet winner, whenever they come up on the agenda, they're going to beat that person and then continue beating people until they actually win the election. Let's look at board account. To calculate the board account, each voter gives 2 points to their top choice, 1 point to second place, and 0 points for third. Let's take a second to calculate these Borda scores. Coleman gets 70 points here, 28 and 20 gets 118 points. Humphrey wins 35 points, 56 points, and 17 points for 108. And Ventura, just the last two groups here, Ventura gets 40 plus 34, 74 points. Coleman wins a narrow board account victory over Humphrey. And Ventura is a pretty distant third place in this race. There's one voting system we skipped. We skipped approval voting, where you get to vote for all of the candidates you approve of. We don't have enough data from polling to really know if people approved of just their top choice or their top two. So let's review. Majority rules, nobody wins. A runoff, Coleman wins. Condorcet winner, that's Coleman. He wins all the head-to-heads. Any agenda you want, Coleman. Board account, Coleman. The only voting system where Jesse Ventura wins the election, it just happens to be the system that was used that day, plurality voting. If your intuition is like most people, you have a question about these voting systems, which is, which one's best? And that's what economist Kenneth Arrow provided the answer to. No voting method does what we think it should. After the quick conundrum, we'll see exactly what it was that he proved. Here's a simple question. When does every full moon rise? Most people think it has to change depending on the season, and they're right, but there's still a single answer that works all of the time. Here's the answer. Every full moon rises right around sunset. Not exact, it might be 20 minutes early or late, but it's a great answer with a really simple geometrical reason. Well, think about it. The moon looks different at different times of the month because of the different portion of it that's lit by the sun. If you view the situation from above, from over the North Pole, see, if the moon is on the same side of us as the sun, that's a new moon. We don't see any of the lit side. Where's the moon during a full moon? It's on the opposite side of the sun. It's not quite precisely opposite, or we'd have a lunar eclipse, but it's really close. So if the moon and sun are on opposite sides, when does the moon rise? At exactly the same time that we stop seeing the sun. We begin to see the moon at the same time we stop seeing the sun. Every full moon rises at sunset. Now, it's true, it happens at different times during different seasons, at different latitudes, depending if there's mountains in the way, things like that. But it's a question with one answer that's able to cover all of the possibilities, unlike voting, where no single method works, in some sense of that word. Kenneth Arrow is an American-born economist. He was educated at Columbia University, and as of 2014, he's an emeritus professor at Stanford. In 1972, he shared the Nobel Prize in Economics at age 51 for his work in voting theory, largely honoring his work in his 1951 PhD thesis, which was highly mathematical. There's no Nobel Prize in mathematics, but he won one in economics. Arrow described a few conditions as ideal, and any voting system ought to have these. These range from simple to more complicated. Here's a slightly simplified version of 4 of these conditions. The first condition is that it be a non-dictatorship. More than one person's vote should really count. The second condition is universality. Anyone is allowed to order the candidates in any rational way, but it must be non-cyclic. No single person should prefer A to B, B to C, and C to A. And so the results of voting should be a complete ranking of all of the options once you get everybody's votes together. The third condition is unanimity. If everyone prefers A to B, then A should beat B, or should at least be ahead in the final rankings. The fourth condition is a little bit more complicated. It's called the independence of irrelevant alternatives. To explain this, let's take a food-related example where it's violated, and that feels sort of really obvious. Suppose you're in a restaurant and a waitress comes over and offers you dessert. Would you like apple pie or blueberry pie? I'll give you a minute to think. And you might say, oh, I'll take the apple. And if she says, wait, I forgot to tell you we also have cherry, it would be very strange for you to reply, well, in that case, I'll take the blueberry. It would make sense to switch to the cherry that she offered you as a third option. But if the decision is between apple and blueberry, then cherry is really an irrelevant alternative. Arrow's fourth condition says that if A defeats B when C is in the race, then A should still defeat B if C drops out. Now, clearly the US presidential elections, they fail this test. Polls are pretty clear that if Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot in Florida, Al Gore would have won the 2000 election in Florida and then won the election in the United States. Arrow argued that this independence of irrelevant alternatives was a common sense and a desirable quality. So, what does Arrow's theorem say about these 4 conditions: non-dictatorship, universality, unanimity, and the independence of irrelevant alternatives? He says that no voting system has all 4, none. It's not possible. Every voting system violates at least one of these conditions. And what do we make of this theorem today? Now, there's this romantic view of democracy as establishing the will of the people. Arrow's theorem says that there's no way for elections to determine the will. It's just more complicated than that. And examples of different voting systems show that which system you choose definitely matters. Arrow's theorem shows no system reaches fairness as you might think. Now, other researchers went on and they studied the different flaws and susceptibilities of different systems to strategic voting. But if you go back and look at the proof of Arrow's theorem, it's a really interesting mathematical proof. He starts by assuming that a voting system has all the conditions except the dictatorship condition. And then, if it's not a unanimous vote between A and B, he works and finds a pivotal voter, a voter that, if the preferences changed a bit, would swing the election from A to B or the reverse. And then finally, he uses that to prove that the pivotal voter is actually a dictator, has complete control over the election. It's really interesting to see how these 3 conditions lead to this last step. So the last voting paradox we'll talk about today is called the chairs paradox, and it's a really strange one. But to understand it, we have to think about being in some sort of organization where the way to break ties is to allow the chair to break that tie. Now, Sometimes the chair is not a member of the body. Think about the vice president breaking ties in the US Senate. But sometimes the chair is also a voting member, and so we're going to think about that case. You would think that being chair would give you more power. And as we've seen, in some cases that's true, deciding the agenda and agenda voting, for instance. But amazingly, that's not always true. There are cases where being chair makes it less likely that you'll get the outcome you want. Let's see how that works. Let's go back to this first example where we saw this cycle, this Condorcet paradox, where Rebecca, Steve, and Tim were choosing Brazilian, Chinese, and Danish for dinner. Let's imagine for a second that Rebecca is the chair and gets to break all of the ties by choosing B. That's her most desired outcome. Now, that sounds great for Rebecca. Rebecca has a little bit more power. But amazingly, sometimes her best bet is to give somebody else that tie-breaking power. In some cases, her having the tie-breaking power means that her least favorite option is going to win because of that extra power she has. So suppose all three of them know each other's preferences. First, let's just think from Rebecca's perspective and figure out what her strategy is. Remember, her top choice is B, is Brazilian. Now, if Steve and Tim agree, if they both vote for Chinese, then it really doesn't matter what Rebecca votes. But if Steve and Tim disagree, then Rebecca votes for Brazilian. Either Brazilian wins 2-1, or there's a tie. Everything gets one vote, and she breaks the tie and gets to go for Brazilian through a tiebreaker. So Rebecca's strategy here is clear. It's always better for her to choose B, to choose Brazilian. If the other two agree with each other, then her vote doesn't matter. If they disagree, then Rebecca gets her top choice when she chooses B. This type of analysis is called domination. For Rebecca, the options C and D are dominated by the option B, Brazilian. No matter how Steve and Tim vote, Rebecca gets the same or better outcome by voting for Brazilian than voting for either of the other two options. Remember, for her, it's Brazilian and then Chinese and then Danish. Mathematically now, we've reduced this three-dimensional problem with three different people to a two-dimensional problem because we know that Rebecca is going to vote for Brazilian. So now let's look at Steve and Tim and figure out what their options are and how they're going to vote. So on the left side, we can list the possible votes for Steve, and along the top, we can list the possible votes for Tim. We can figure out the outcome. Remember, Rebecca is definitely going to vote for Brazilian. If either Steve or Tim votes for Brazilian, then Brazilian definitely wins with 2 votes, or at least 2 votes. If either Steve or Tim can make sure that B wins, that Brazilian wins, because they know that Rebecca is going to vote for Brazilian. Well, can they do better on their list of preferences? See, for Steve, it's Chinese, then Danish, then Brazilian. Anything's better than Brazilian. For Tim, it's Danish, then Brazilian, then Chinese. He would rather have Danish than Brazilian. So let's look at it from Tim's perspective. Remember, for Tim, it's Danish, then Brazilian, and then Chinese. Voting for Danish now dominates, and here's why. You see, if Steve votes for Chinese, then Tim should vote for Danish because he thinks that Brazilian is better than Chinese. If Steve votes for Danish, then Tim should vote for Danish because he thinks that Danish is better than Brazilian. Either way, Tim should vote for Danish. So here's what we know now. Rebecca is definitely going to vote for Brazilian, and Tim is definitely going to vote for Danish. Now, Steve is smart, and he knows their preferences, and he can think through all of these things. So now let's look at what Steve does. Steve prefers Chinese to Danish to Brazilian. If he votes for Chinese, then Brazilian is going to win when Rebecca breaks the tie. If he votes for Danish, then Danish wins. And so Steve thinks, oh, Danish is better than Brazilian, and so Steve votes for Danish. So they take the vote, Rebecca votes for Brazilian, and Steve and Tim both vote for Danish. Danish wins. In mathematical terms, Danish is what's called the Nash equilibrium. This is after John Nash, the subject of the movie Beautiful Mind. What's amazing here is that Rebecca's tie-breaking power caused Steve and Tim to vote differently, and the end result was that she got her least preferred option. She would have been better off giving somebody else the power of being chair. That's pretty mind-bending. This chair's paradox was first written about in 1958 by Robin Farquharson. He was a South African game theorist. His doctoral dissertation delved into this and other interesting voting paradoxes. Tragically, Farquharson descended into mental illness. He ended up dying a homeless man on the streets of London in a fire set by arsonists. But his voting paradox lives on. And as with all of these other oddities of voting, his paradox shows us how much is hidden behind this seemingly simple act of voting. Next time, we're going to go a little bit deeper into politics and look at the paradoxes of apportionment.